Hello, Chris Keyack here, and welcome to this sneak preview of MagiTab by CMK BIM Consulting. Ever since 2005, when I first started working with Tekla and at Tekla, I've dreamed about simplifying the process of teaching new users how to learn applying Shear Tab and Shear Connections in Tekla structures. I've done a lot of jobs on the West Coast where Shear Tab connections are the predominant connection that's utilized for shear. And so basically what I want to show you here is that on the right hand side of the screen, this is all of the out of the box different connections that Tekla Structures has for all the different Shear Tab connections. This makes it a little bit tough for users to get started. They have to memorize which connections work best for different scenarios, and it's not super intuitive just for you to get started as a detailer and just read the design drawings and the connection information and apply that in the model. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce MagiTab, which is one simple component that looks at all the different framing conditions and some basic setups and overrides that you have, and then it allows you to just simply apply those connections in the model. Now, before we start applying connections, you'll see that there's a connection setup here. If I actually use Excel, we can just create all of the different design connection information from the Shear tab connection schedule and the design drawings. We can then do a variety of different things based on the nominal depth and whether we're doing beam to beam connections or whether we're doing beam to column. So we can specify the framing condition. So that way you have different settings for beam to column web versus beam to beam and beam to column flange. And you might also have some specialized full depth connections and far side stiffener connections that you need, and you can specify all of that design criteria here. At the very bottom, we've got basically a set of defaults that if none of these rules up here on the top are applied, then it just uses this last criteria by nominal depth, and it works on all framing conditions. So once we've got that all set, we then come in here and we can say import. We just select that file and then press open, and then it imports that data here. Now we can also manually change any of that data or add new rows and delete rows as needed here within this setup. But there you go, you've got all of your design criteria information here, and then all you got to do is just make sure that the connection mark is set to be automatic, or you can specifically set a certain one, or you can manually enter in all the values however you'd like to do it. Now, once we've got that all set, we're just going to go ahead and start applying connections in the model. So we pick our primary and our secondary, and then notice that it automatically looks at the framing condition. I don't have to pick connection 186 or 146 for the flange. It automatically puts in the stiffeners there for me based on the design criteria. It also puts the connection code in here for me. And let's just go ahead and do a beam command, or beam connection here as well. So you can see that I'm not switching between different connections. I'm not loading and applying properties. I'm not entering anything. All my data was already set up in the connection schedule, and here I'm just simply applying connections. If I then come into this column, let's go to the properties here, and let's just change the rotation on this and press modify. It automatically reruns the connections, and it knows that the framing conditions have changed, so it then puts stiffeners here versus the other connection, and everything switches automatically. Now what's really cool is if I go ahead and go to the user-defined attributes on this piece, it will also apply the end connection code here automatically for me. So we'll just select both of these so you can see that. Now if you do have some specialized design connections like full depth or a far side stiffener that you need on certain connections, then what you can do is you can actually set that connection code beforehand and make sure that that's checked during the framing phase. And then you can actually come inside of MagiTab and you can tell it to basically apply the connection instead of using the design criteria here automatically and selecting it. Then basically you can set this as reading from the beam encode. Now what you can also do is if you need to, you can override any of the connection settings. So if we come in here and we select on this component, and let's say that we want to use 4 bolts here and we say modify. Now this is what's really great about this is whenever I set any of these values here and it's still trying to read from the connection setup, then what it does is any of these values that have been filled in, it's now considered a user connection. So user is then put inside of the connection code here and the connection status. That way I know as a checker that I need to come back and take a look at this. Then you'll also see that there's this verify first hole. So basically in the connection setup, I was able to specify 3 inches down to the first hole, but now basically what it's done is it's saying that because I tried to get 4 bolts here at 3-inch spacing, it had to move the distance to the first bolt and decrease that. And then it also checks to see whether that'll still fit with a tight cope there, which it does. And so it basically moves the tab and the bolt so that way it can fit all of those bolts here inside of the beam web. Now when it does that, it tells me to verify the first hole. And so that way I can again take a look at this and make sure as a checker that I've got my eyes on this and making sure that everything is okay. So what's great here is that not only is it saving time in selecting the connections and filling in the properties, it's actually now a system. So you have your design criteria that works for a majority of connections, and then if you need to override certain conditions based on special areas on the design or due to just geometry and framing conditions, you can easily do those changes, and you can mark them as user so the checker knows what to come look at in more depth and detail. Now be on the lookout for new updates as I mature the MagiTab component, and please feel free to reach out to me if you want to get on the waiting list of potentially testing out and purchasing MagiTab once it's fully complete and ready for production use.